you and I like what you do, so I'm very pleased that you've asked me to come along. I'm genuinely flattered to be able to speak to you this afternoon. I wonder what you were doing at 1:27 this morning, 1:27 a.m. this morning. I was doing something highly unusual. I was standing naked from the waist up, looking at myself in the mirror. I haven't done that for a long time, and I can understand why the minute I started doing it this time. And the reason I was doing that is because I had hiccups. And I haven't had hiccups for a very long time. Now, I was thinking about this. When I was a kid, I used to get hiccups all the time. And then I remember in my 20s, occasionally I'd get hiccups. But I couldn't remember the last time I got hiccups. And they were on and off throughout the evening. I was trying to watch a film that was interrupting my enjoyment of Cloud Atlas. Do you know why? Does anyone here know why we hiccup? It's such a fundamental thing, isn't it? If you don't know why you hiccup, maybe I've gone off you. What a hiccup? Well, there are two theories, basically. There are two theories. Firstly, a hiccup is an involuntary contraction of the diaphragm, followed a quarter of a second later by the closure of our vocal cords. It's that gives it the characteristic hiccup. Hiccup being an onomatopoeic word for the process. But this would have to have a purpose. Everything that we do as organisms, every organism out there, there's no redundancy. So hiccuping has a value. Or it may have had a value, maybe on its way out. There were two schools of thought. One, a phylogenetic one, that it's a relic of us being amphibians. Because when you think about it, tadpoles have to gulp their air in order to, they don't have lungs, so they have to gulp their air in order to maximise the use of their gills. And what we see is that in the womb, at the fetal stage, there's fetal hiccuping. But the theory that I favour a little more is that the only animals that hiccup are mammals, and more specifically, mammals that drink milk. And we think that we hiccup because during the process of drinking milk, as an infant, we can ingest air instead of milk, and this goes into our stomach, and therefore it restricts the amount of milk you can drink at a time when you're clamouring for as much nutrition as possible. So it's thought that we hiccup to evacuate our stomach of that air so that we can continue to drink milk. And since only milk-drinking mammals hiccup, that lends itself to that. And since, as we get older and older, hiccuping becomes rarer and rarer, and I ended up drinking milk a long time ago now, that seems to be the theory. One bloke, there was a guy, his name was Charles Osborne, he was an American, he had hiccups for 68 years consecutively. We think that he hiccuped 430 million times. There's a Trivial Pursuit answer for you there. Anyway, so I don't know why, but I always used to look at myself in the mirror when I was hiccuping, and I found myself doing it again last night. I had a secondary reason, and that is that I'm absolutely covered with bites here. And I think they're bed bug bites, because I've just been somewhere where there was a multitude of ticks, and I get bitten by ticks relatively frequently. I get bitten by mosquitoes and fleas. Bed bugs irregularly. I once bought a house and it was infected with bed bugs. It took me a long time to get rid of them, so I'm familiar with the bite. And therefore, I think that, I won't show you the rest, but, I think I was bitten by bed bugs. You'll wonder where I got them, and it was actually on a commercial airliner. I got onto the flight and I was bite-free, and I got off and I'm absolutely covered with these itchy bites. I think it was bed bugs. Anyway, so I was there, hiccuping, counting my bed bug bites, and this led me to look at my tattoos, which again I've not looked at for a long time. Which is bizarre, isn't it? Because when I've ever had a tattoo, it's been a momentous moment in my life. It's not something that I've done casually. I've thought about every one of those decorations, and they're all there for pretty poignant reasons, mostly to try and get over some trauma or other, which is probably why I haven't looked at them in detail. And then I sort of started getting really maudlin. By now it's about 1:37. And I'm thinking, who am I? And here I am, having bed bug bites, hiccuping for the first time in about 35 years. And I'm inspecting my very personal tattoos. And I'm thinking, I'm 58 years old. what am I doing and what have I done? It's one of those evenings.
Too much beer.
Mentally, I'm not in too great a place, to be quite honest with you. I lived most of my life in a fog of disappointment, a fog of failure. I think that I've failed in my principal duty in the time that I've had. On the one side, that might strike you as depressing and not a nice place to be, but for me, long ago, I realised that sort of emotional thing, whether it's that or anger, needs to be used as an energy. So for me, living in a fog of self-disappointment, self-appreciation is actually quite motivating. Because I'm 58, and every day goes by, I've got less time. And with all the hope in my heart, I hope I've got less time than the vast majority of you in here. But it therefore compels me to generate a sense of urgency. And what I've noticed in my life is that that urgency has grown the older that I've got. So where's the fog of disappointment coming from? Where is that sense of failure originating? It's because I grew up with a love of the natural world. You know, I was getting flea bites aged 3. You know, I was picking up tadpoles and eating them. You know, yeah. And then, you know, I needed to understand how it all works, so I got myself an education, a good education. I do have a fundamental understanding of how things work, and I've been very fortunate I found employment which has allowed me to continue to educate myself. Nothing could be finer than that, to be able to indulge lifelong interest, very often at the behest of people who I meet for an hour, for a day, who tell me everything they know about something that I'm interested in, and they know more than me. What an extraordinary opportunity. But the fuel for all of that is the simple love for nature, that desire to see not just individual species, which can be considered beautiful in isolation, but to be able to admire that greater beauty when you see them interacting in a dynamic, harmonious community. Very infrequently we get to see those communities intact these days, but there are still plenty of, you know, parts of that web which are joined. And to see those things and to understand those things and to revel in those things is the fuel. That's what motivates me. And it's motivated me for a long time. And yet during the course of that time, all of those things which I loved so dearly have been declining. Have been declining on my watch, and therefore I can't help but feel responsible for that. Not just me, I'm not going to take all the blame. Perhaps my generation and a few other generations around me. That's causing me a lot of grief. I don't think, you know, I can have a happy death, because I'm not going to be, if I'm given a slow death, I'm not going to have the ability to find any reconciliation with the fact that at this point in time, the world isn't in a worse place than it was when I popped onto it in 1961. Now, I'm going to hit you with a couple of figures. I'm not going to go on too much about stats, because the vast majority of you here will know these stats. And if you don't know them precisely, you don't really need them spelling out in total detail. But, I mean, ultimately, you know, we are in a bad place in the UK when it comes to our biodiversity. There is no question about that. You know, we are living in one of the most nature-depleted parts of the world. In the front of this manifesto, which I'll go on to talking about in a moment, bullfinches down to 39%. White admirals, butterfly, beautiful species, absolutely beautiful. 71% decline in the last 25 years. You know? Tree sparrows, 90% decline. I found a tree sparrow's nest in the school grounds in Southampton when I was a kid. What I'm trying to do is to make it tangible to you that in my lifetime of interest, care and appreciation, these catastrophic declines have been taking place, you know, and that to me is not tolerable. That is never going to make me a happy bloke. There's no doubt about that. Here we are. Between 1970, which is when I got into birds, feathered birds, in 1970. Yeah. And 2013, 56% of UK species declined. Of the nearly 8,000 species assessed using modern criteria, this is data from the last State of Nature report, 8,000 species assessed, 15% are threatened with extinction. Of the 218 countries assessed for biodiversity intactness, the UK is ranked 189. A consequence of industrialisation, urbanisation, over-exploitation of our natural resources. Since 1970, more broadly than the UK, we've lost 50% of the world's wildlife. Since I was watching Thunderbirds for the first time, what was NBC? That's on my watch. We've lost 50% of the wildlife. You couldn't meet a bloke, there are many other blokes and women of my age who is more concerned about this, and yet we've failed. There is no other way of looking at it. I've failed, we have failed, because those declines have taken place. So, is there any hope? There's obviously hope. So I continue to set my alarm clock, get up and try and do something about it. How is that hope? How can we see that hope? What manifestation of hope is there? Well, I think it occurs in several forms. Firstly, alongside charting all of these hideous declines, we have been evolving the technology to redress them, to restore habitats, to rebuild environments. We've not been slacking on the job, our generation. We've been monitoring things with a greater clarity than ever before. We've been devising and implementing technologies to allow us to do that, but also we've been learning how to fix things. And I think that we've got a pretty good arsenal, a pretty good toolkit of fixes. This summer, just a few days ago, I had a remarkable experience. Again, another privilege of my job. So Roy Dennis and Tim Mackerel, who's here somewhere, who is there, invited me to see the sea eagles, which they were releasing in the Isle of Wight. Now, when I got into birds in 1970, sea eagles had been extinct in the UK for about, 100 years. Less than that, actually, 70 years. And a project started in the early 70s, really got going in the mid-70s, to reintroduce sea eagles in the Western Isles of Scotland. And it worked. Those birds have been flying around there. It took a little while to get started. They're long-lived, slow to mature, some dispersed, all sorts of problems. But it's worked. We've got the sea eagle back as a breeding species. And that's fantastic. And I had opportunities to go and see them up there in Scotland. At that same time, red kites, there was just a handful of inbred red kites in remote valley in Wales getting pestered by collectors. I went up there, warned them for a while to stop these miscreants stealing their eggs. In 1989, a consortium of people reintroduced red kites into the UK. I had a meeting with Michael Gove a couple of weeks ago, and I went into his office there at DEFRA, and I looked out the window before we started speaking, and there were 2 red kites soaring over. So I called him over and pointed them out. He enjoyed looking at them. Red kites in London, they were on my garden list. As a child, I remember getting on a National Express coach and going to that remote valley in central Wales because I wanted to see red kites before they became extinct. They didn't become extinct. We put them back. We put the sea eagles back. Now we're not just putting sea eagles back in Scotland, we're putting sea eagles onto the Isle of Wight in southern England. And this project will work because the technique has been tried and tested, not just in the UK, but in other places too. Tim, Roy, the rest of the team have got the competence, the ability, the confidence to do this. So, in my lifetime, there's a chance that I'll not only have red kite on my garden bird list, I'll also get sea eagle on my garden bird list. Can you imagine? You tell go back in time and tell the 14, 15-year-old Chris that he's going to have sea eagle and red kite on his garden list alongside raven and peregrine falcon and goshawk, all of which I've seen in or even perched in my garden in the New Forest, and I would have burst. We're also very fortunate to have been spoken to, I presume, by Derek Gow, another one of our great conservationists, a doer. Derek has pioneered the introduction of water voles, beavers, other animals. We have the ability. It's been tried and tested. I think Derek would admit himself, the first few water vole introductions, I know they did one on a WWT site, and they let them all out, and the herons came and ate the whole lot about day 2. But we made mistakes, we've learned how to do it. We have the capacity. I'm just talking about what I would call flagship projects, the big exciting stuff, raptors, top of the food chain, t-shirt animals. Beneath that, we've evolved enormous capability to look after things, to rebuild things, to understand their ecology, their behaviour, their physiology, whatever it happens to be, captive breed them, whatever. And when it comes to not species, but environments, again, scientists have been equally diligent in their ability to unravel how these environments work, what their requirements to be sustainable and functional are, and we know how to keep them in that state. There's absolutely no ambiguity about that. So, what's been going on? You've got the people that have done the work. Why are so many? Why are 15% of species threatened with extinction? We're putting seedlings and kites back and all this sort of stuff. Because these are isolated projects, and these projects have really struggled in the past to happen. They've been thwarted. Now, another project that Derek's been involved with is the reintroduction of white storks, which built a nest. If you were watching Spring Watch this year, you might have known, or you've seen it on the news, but white storks have built a nest for the first time in 400 years on the Net estate in Sussex. Charlie Bowl, Isabella Tree, we wilded an area there, and they've started to put white storks back. So again, I know it's another high-profile reintroduction. What's interesting is perhaps the history of this reintroduction, because it was a real struggle to get it going. Despite the fact that it was going to work, it's working. There were plenty of people who couldn't see the benefits, didn't understand those benefits, didn't want it to happen, were over-cautious. They're just not the right people with the right mindset. That has been our problem. That's why those declines have occurred. It's not because we don't understand how to stop them or how to fix them. It's because we've got the wrong people not doing anything. We've got to change that. So who are the wrong people? Well, a few years ago, I would have had a right to go, as my father says, at our NGOs, the Wildlife Trust, the Wildlife and Wetland Trust, Butterfly Conservation, Bat Conservation Trust, RSPB. I think we've seen a shift. I think they're becoming bolder and braver, but not enough yet. Why is that likely to be the case?
Will close in 20 minutes.
Better move on.
To enjoy free entry to our other benefits on your next visit, speak to a member of staff. Thank you.
Fellowship's going to go into life history of Stegosaurus. So, basically, are they being bold enough? No, I don't think they are being bold enough. They're still being cautious. And there are all sorts of inherent problems with them. And I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is a thing which particularly irks me. So this is just an isolated example. And that is hunting, principally fox hunting. Now, I've got a report here. I'm going to first get off my phone in order to learn it today. I've been filming other things. This is an article in the Independent newspaper. It's published September last year. The head of a conservation charity is facing increasing pressure to step down because of his firm's sponsorship of hunts and game bird shoots. Critics say that Michael Batt's position as chairman of the Kent Wildlife Trust is at odds with his support for activities that involve a loss of wildlife. More than 200,000 people have signed a petition calling for the Trust to sever its links with Mr. Baggs, who served as a huntsman and a joint master for hare hunting group, and supports other hunts and allows pheasant shooting on his farm. Wildlife lovers also planned to protest at Saturday's annual general meeting of the Kent Wildlife Trust to demand his removal. As far as I know, he's still there. What's that old expression? Foxing's charge for the hen house? Why in the 21st century, given the enormous breadth of talent, educated talent that we have in our community, ecologists, zoologists, conservationists, why have we got at the head of the Kent Wildlife Trust a body who we trust to be looking after that part of our country's wildlife, a man who has, and maybe still does, think that it's okay for dogs to run around tearing hares to pieces? How does that compute? It doesn't compute for me at all. I would argue that he's entirely misplaced in his employment there, and that he should be instantaneously replaced. Not least because the losses of brown hare, have been increasing. So we have an increased urgency to look after these species. This isn't a decision, that we would think differently about 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. This is a decision about now, when things are in absolute crisis. And I'm afraid to say that perhaps I'm fairly picked upon Mr. Baggs, but across the spectrum of our NGOs, within their boards of trustees, are still a lot of people who have conflicting interests with their overall objectives. Now, conspiracy theorists would say that they perhaps wormed their way in there so that they could wield some influence. Within the Wildlife Trust, those other NGOs, I'm not entirely sure. I think this is a legacy of when that fraternity were part and parcel of the people who owned land. And if you owned land, you shot and hunted things. But at the same time, you had a genuine interest in that land and its conservation and the species that lived there. Formed these bodies, and they became part and parcel of their makeup. So for me, it's a historical legacy. It's not one we should be entertaining anymore, because we've run out of time, because we have these people who are better placed. And it's not just our NGOs, it's our statutory bodies, our government bodies too. I'll read you a second piece here. And this is a piece, again, in The Independent. This was published in August of last year. Countryside campaigners have expressed outrage over a decision by the Environment Secretary, then Michael Gove, to give a prominent role on a body set up to protect wildlife to an ardent supporter of hunting. Michael Gove has appointed Lord Glen Cathver, who once said it was essential to get pro-hunting MPs into Parliament as Deputy Chairman of Natural England. The Conservative peer, who as MP David McLean was a minister at the then Ministry of Agriculture, voted 6 times against the fox hunting ban. Lord Glen Cathver is Vice Chair of Natural England, the statutory body which we pay our taxes to look after the UK's wildlife. Further, on that board is a lady called Teresa Dent. Now, Teresa Dent is the CEO of the Game Conservation and Wildlife Trust. The Game Conservation and Wildlife Trust are prominent advocates of shooting, constantly cherry-pick information to undermine the integrity of the science that we have that shows that birds of prey are being persecuted, that grouse moors are being burned, drained, so on and so forth. One might imagine that both Lord Glen Cathver and Teresa Dent are on that board with a mission. Surely they're there to lobby for their interests in a body which is meant to be looking after our wildlife, not balancing that with desires to misrepresent the truth about shooting and hunting. What on earth is going on? There is no shortage of people to take positions on those boards who could put the genuine purpose of those bodies in place. DEFRA, working very closely with Natural England, are still supporting the badger cull. There can't be I don't even need to go on about it, there can't be a person in this room who doesn't know that all of the science suggests that culling badgers is not the answer to dealing with the critical issue of bovine tuberculosis. And yet, DEFRA are still talking about expanding these plans. At the moment, we've been trying to stop them expanding the cull into Derbyshire, where the Wildlife Trust, not all bad, never said they were, some great wildlife trusts and some great people doing great things in those wildlife trusts out there, okay, have been vaccinating those badgers in Derbyshire. Not a single badger that's been culled has been tested to even see if it's got TB. Why are they going to go and kill a load of badgers which can't possibly have TB because they've been vaccinated? It's madness. It's because the wrong people are in the wrong job. Whose fault's that? It's mine again, I'm afraid. Not just me. It's our generation. Because we have voted the wrong people in, we've allowed a system of governance to develop which is certainly not democratic and certainly not one which makes best informed decisions based upon best scientific knowledge. In fact, a paper was published about 5 years ago which showed that government had ignored 80% of all of the science given to them when it came to making decisions about what to do. So we're employing people to make the wrong decisions. It's not working. That's why we've had those declines. It's not that people can't fix it. They're fixing it, small scale. We've got the wrong people. And I'm talking about conservation here in the UK. Let's spin it out to some bigger issues. Two bigger issues. Climate change is upon us. We've been given a very strict deadline by scientists, so I can't believe it. The IPCC, an independent body of international scientists that are using the best data that they've got to predict things, all their mathematics. They're the best qualified people we've got. I'm not saying they're going to be 100% right, but I'm going to trust them to be closer to it than anyone else. I imagine we would too. And they've given us, 10, 12 years to sort this issue out. I mean, the writing's on the wall. We've been talking, I've been listening to it since I was a child watching Blue Peter, when it was in black and white. Yeah, that's how old I am. We've just been watching the Amazon burn on our flat screen 4K TVs. Nothing's changed. The football pitches that we talk about, we've been talking about for the last 58 years as far as I can make out. And now we've been given a deadline. And what's happening? Not much. Not from those people in government. Still talking about short-term things. Still talking about GDP, economic growth, which of course requires consumption, which feeds into that vicious feedback loop of exacerbating climate change. If you mine stuff and make stuff, you make carbon, it gets into the atmosphere. Farming. We know full well, again, there's no ambiguity about it, the world is eating too much meat. I'm a vegan. You might consider that extreme. I don't think we all need to be vegans. I think at this point in time, if we all just went vegan overnight, it'd be a disaster for the environment, to be quite honest with you. Mixed farming, good quality farming, animals with good quality life, farmers that are able to make a profit, we pay them properly for what they do, maintain good standards of animal welfare. There's still a role for that to be played at this point in time, there's no doubt about that. I'm not anti-meat farming. I'm not very keen on factory farming. I'm not very keen on growing soil and shipping 80% of it to China to feed pigs because they've got a burgeoning meat, taste for meat. That isn't going to work. Agriculture produces more climate gases than damaging gases than transport or anything else. We're not doing very much about that, are we? And then the reason I'm interested in this